Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our this month's episode of Talking Education. And I'm really pleased that we've got an amazing panel who are going to introduce themselves in a moment. And tonight we're going to be looking at private education and whether or not, or try to have a deeper understanding about why we have the private education system in this country and whether there's a continued need. And what we're looking at is why we would need them, given that children in the state sector have better outcomes than the children who are in private education system. So we're going to start off with introductions, and we'll start with Dr. Valerie Daniel.
Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you all for being here. My name is Valerie Daniel. I currently work as an executive teacher over to nursery schools in Birmingham, but my other hat is of education. And with that, I have a voracious interest in all things education. I've just completed a project on education theory with Aaron Bradbury and Ruth Swales, and with some other amazing educational writers. I'm also currently writing a book on systemic intervention in early years practice, which is essentially about anti-racist practice in education. So that's me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing, Val. And now we've got Hazel Pinner, and this is our first time meeting. So it's a real pleasure.
It's an honour to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I am a primary teacher in Scotland, in Orkney, so right up north, just before you fall off the maps, for those of you further south. And I teach, currently I teach primary 3, which is year 2 equivalent in the Scottish curriculum. And so that's my role. I'm obviously working within the state sector. This is an interesting conversation because within Orkney, we don't have any private schools to be had in our local community. So it's an interesting one to come into. And I'm fairly new to teaching. This is just my 4th year of teaching, so I'm still getting to grips with it a wee bit. And beyond that, I'm very much committed to and passionate about, and have been throughout my adult life, in terms of issues around equality and diversity. I'm becoming more aware, especially as I've got into my 30s in the last few years, about the position and privilege I have and I've had growing up. Because of who I am and how I've grown up, as well as being more aware of maybe the obstacles, actually looking back in terms of what obstacles faced my parents raising me and my brother, but also in terms of where I've had advantages and definite privilege, and looking at how I then use my voice to support and amplify others and to make sure that I'm calling out discrimination and inequalities where I see it, so that we do have a better future for the children I'm teaching now, but also the future generations as well.
Totally wonderful. Thank you so much, Hazel. I really appreciate that you've joined us. And it is going to be an interesting perspective given who you are, where you live, and all of those sorts of things. And yeah, absolutely wonderful. And then we've got Sufian Sadiq, who was going to join a panel before, but he pushed us out because he apparently had tickets to this amazing football match. But I'm really, really happy that he's here today. And introduce yourself, please, Sufian.
Hi everyone, my name is Sufian Sadiq. I'm going to give a little prior warning. I've put 2 children down in bed and my wife's still at her parents' evening or something. So I'm hoping they'll play ball with me and they'll stay in bed. But if there's any interruptions, I'm going to have to just try and calmly tuck them back in. I'm Director of Teaching School at Chiltern Learning Trust. We're one of the largest teaching schools in the country. We're a huge provider of the MPQs, the early careers. We're one of the largest CPD providers nationally, and that's been something that we're incredibly proud of. But I sit on the board for the Chartered College of Teaching, and I like to say I'm a real pain into the system. I'm a disruptor. I like to challenge the status quo. I'm very, very privileged that I have a really good position in a really good organization, which I take as a real responsibility, to say that actually with that position comes responsibility, and that responsibility for me is about really challenging what's happening in the system around inequality wherever it's possible. So yep, that's me, that's what I do, and I'm really looking forward to taking part in this discussion.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. So as I said, we do have an amazing panel who bring a real diversity in voices here. And I think that's what adds to the conversation. And I love the fact that you see yourself as a disruptor, Sufian, because what I do want are people who see themselves as disruptors to come along and share their views, because yeah, we want to build and be stronger and better. So Sufian, maybe if we stay with you, and I shared various articles. Maybe I can sort of run through some of the things which you shared, which was some of it was around the data, which gives us a clear understanding that children who the outcomes from children in state education are higher than the outcomes of children who are in the private sector. So the question is, why do we need private education? And Sufian, it'd be really great if you could get the ball rolling.
I think the child A versus child B, is child A from X location, X part of the world more intelligent naturally than child B? What we know is actually there's no data. There's no data to suggest one child is naturally more brighter or more intelligent than another child. What we know is that the privileges that follow the point of birth is what the real question and challenge is. I do a lot of work in Africa, and what we know is that actually that's the challenge of poverty. The biggest challenge of the inequality globally is that some children don't get an opportunity to go to a school. Some children do not have access to basic education, and that impacts them. The issue around state and private. Am I against private education per se? No, because I genuinely see the fact that actually, if my children are going to go into the system at a lower level than other children because of the fact that they're Muslim, because of the fact that they're Pakistani heritage, because of the fact that they're probably from a demographic, an area, a part of Britain, Luton, so we're probably seen as a working class town. There's a number of obstacles that they'll have to face based on the fact that some of the things are totally out of their control, especially the race element. And we know that actually the chances of success for those in private are significantly higher, irrelevant of ability at the point of outcomes. What we know is that whole notion of meritocracy falls apart in education, because actually you can work really hard in a state school, but you're not going to get the same privilege in life that you might from a private school. And the question I would ask is, if every Black and Asian person could send their kids to, why narrow that gap to that private school? Should they? Well, I'll do anything to narrow the gap. I'll do anything to give my children a better crack and better start at life. And that's the real dilemma here, that with money and with the privileges that come, is not only that the outcomes here are better. Outcomes here are better in a state school situation. However, the end goal, the social end goal, they will be CEOs, they will be leaders in industry, they will be X, they will be Y. These guys can only go into positions of qualified. So you can be a doctor because it's always about the exams and you've got to prove yourself through. So actually meritocracy works in being a doctor, because if you're good at that craft and you can be assessed fairly against everyone, you'll rise. What they can't do is be a CEO, because actually FTSE 100 is made up of nearly 100 men. There's more men with the name Smith than there are Black people in the FTSE 100 companies. There's more Daves in the top 500 companies than they are Black or Asian leaders Your chances of success are far higher if you're just called Dave. If you are from a minority background, the chances go significantly higher with private education. And I think the real dilemma here and the real question it poses for all of us is, why is it that our children in state sector can do so well? What does it count for? And that's where the onus is on us to challenge the system. How do we make the system more equitable to say that actually performance and meritocracy genuinely matters? That actually, if you can afford private and you send them private, but if my kid goes to state and gets the same grades as this kid in private, let them have the same equal opportunity to battle it out for the jobs. Let's not make it that my kid can perform better in a state school, and will still get pipped to the finishing line by somebody who performed less, who didn't do as well, didn't do as richer activities in school as they did, and still ends up better. But there's also the other element, which is, what does private education give our children that we're not seeing come through in state education? That's social network. That we know the social networks are what dictate some of the positions. So the social network, if I grew up with other poor kids and I'm surrounded, my friendship circle is still the circle from where I live. I still live in the same area because that's who I am. So my social network, if I take away the stuff I'm doing in places like this, is always going to be that. And therefore what we know is that's crippling, because your social network is clearly what adds value. And that's the differential when you look at why do they progress. They know the right people in the right places pretty much all of the time. And that's a real added value. The chances are, if you're in a private system, you're going to know an MP. The rest of us have to go to a surgery and wait in a queue to go see an MP. You can speed dial one because actually you probably went to school with one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sufian. That was a really interesting perspective, and I enjoyed listening to it very much. Hazel, would you like to add your perspective, please?
Yes, obviously Scotland's a bit different, and just in general in size and population density compared to England and Wales, there is a difference there. We still have over about 100 private and fee-paying schools in Scotland, majority in the Central Belt, although there are some further north as well. And I think for me, I grew up in Livingston, which is very much a new town, almost halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And it was built as originally to move people from the middle of Glasgow and out of the tenements into this new town. And it's very much a commuter town. So it has at its core some quite deprived areas in which you've got those people that came from those communities and their families were moved or asked to move to these new towns and have that life outside of Glasgow or maybe parts of Edinburgh, and who are seen as quite the homegrown Livingston people. And then you have a lot of people that have moved there and live there because it is a good commuting place and a good town to live in, to commute to Edinburgh and Glasgow, and you've had the development from there. So it's always had quite a split. And I was thinking about this in terms of my own personal experience, because I was in between. My parents bought a house there because that's where they could afford moving out of renting from Edinburgh, but are both from very much working class backgrounds. And so I went to the local state school, and I played chess, and I was on my high school chess team, and we used to then get drawn against like the big name private schools in Edinburgh. So and at this point my school had only just adopted a very casual uniform policy. We would be going rocking in into Edinburgh to these private schools, Merchiston Castle, George Watson's, Heriot's, all of these schools, Stuart Melville's, which are some of the big schools in private schools in Edinburgh, wearing our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, because we didn't have more than that. The school has now developed other uniform options, but we would turn up like that to be playing chess in these massive centuries-old buildings with people that would turn it. And I remember one particular way they would turn it, and they had the hand embroidered ties, and they had the very perfect uniforms, and it was all, and there was that sense you could almost feel us shrinking at times when you arrived. You felt your defences going up. And most of the time, the people that you met and were playing with, they were very respectful, and they were very, and again, they knew all the social norms. Of course, they were going to put on a good show, especially to us sort of poor ones from out of town. But there was that sense, you felt that difference in societal privilege around it. So I think for me, that was kind of my view of it. And again, in Livingston as well, you have kids that are then by the upper primary from some of the schools, are then their parents make the transition and start paying for them to go to the private schools. So they're put through the good state schools up till sort of the end of year 5, P6 in Scotland. And then they do a sort of transition year so that then they're hitting the ground running at the fee-paying schools. And you see that a lot in some of the Edinburgh schools as well. There's a lot. You want to be in certain state schools because even if you're not sending your child to a private school, you know that actually about a quarter of their class, their year group, will be going. So you know their last year of primary school, they will have a much smaller primary and class size, which then means they're getting more teachers' attention, more teachers' time, more resources, because the others have gone off to fee-paying schools. So you've got all these things that then impact on housing prices and on where people want to live and the expectations people have. I remember sitting and listening to someone talking at Edinburgh University while I was doing my teaching certificate about degree on where they needed to move within the next 3 years because of what nursery they were aiming to get their fairly newborn child into, so that they would be in the running to then probably get through to make it into a particular fee-paying school. Mm-hmm. And this child, like this was a 1-year-old child they were talking about, sort of thing. So it is that bit of, if your end goal is to put your child into a fee-pay, and you're not the wealthy, you're the aspirational middle class sort of thing that want to better and want to put your child into private education, you're thinking about that from the time they're born and the pressure that can put on families as well. So I think it is, as you say, it's all the societal expectation and view and how you perceive yourself against others, which is very much this disparity that we see it throughout. We're seeing it played out upon our news day by day about the difference about taking people on merit and their intellectual ability against the size of a parental paycheck and who parents know. And we are seeing that, as you say, in our leaderships and the people that are at the top, not just in business, but in all aspects of our societal structures. In particular, at the moment, we could think of various political stories we could raise. And I think it is this thing of, it's fine if your child is then really going to flourish there, that's great. And you hear of people that actually they know maybe their child has an additional need, or their child has a real strength, and they know that there's this school that actually really excels with their sciences. They've got a real strength for that, and they know that actually that's the best thing for their child's needs. And again, I don't then have a problem in some ways with private education in some aspects, and there are places where it's needed. Again, I was thinking about friends that I know who were whose parents were diplomats. I went to university with at least a couple of people whose fathers were British ambassadors at various points, and they had to go to boarding schools, they had to go to private schools, because where their parents were posted, it wasn't always safe for them to be, or to give them that continuity of education across the time that they were in school. And so they were split from families, and that wasn't choices their parents made easily and made lightly, but that was actually quite a practical decision. It wasn't so much actually about the quality of education, it was more about consistency and safety. So you've got people like that. Now, you would say that is a fairly small number, I know, but you could think that about military families. There's one school in Scotland which is dedicated to providing education for either serving or formerly serving members of Scottish military, so that their children are provided for. So if there's postings around the world, that there is a steadiness and consistency there, and an awareness of the needs and worries that come with family situations like that, of knowing that a parent is off somewhere in a potentially dangerous situation, or somewhere that you can't talk about where they are. You might not even know where they are. And I think there are settings like that that are very quite bespoke and have a definite place. So I'd say that, and things like dual language as well. I'm sure we know of schools that parents are sending them there because actually the reason they're paying the fees is because it means their child is in an English speaking school, but it's also doing French, or it's dual stream French or Russian or whatever else that is. And it meets a key need, some of which is also then tying into other things of identity and ethnicity that a family don't want to lose by sending a child to a school that is predominantly English speaking and state school that doesn't have maybe that same richness of culture and language that they're wanting to carry on, despite the fact that they are British or living in Britain and made their lives here. So I think there's aspects where it can be really enriching. I do also again we see that so often, we see that disparity in how people view each other depending on where you went to school, what type of school you went to, and how people view each other. And again, I think what Sufian was saying about the societal, I suppose, societal graces and etiquette that is learned from a young age by some children, and then people that go through the private setting, schools, education setting, that gives them an easier way to open doors further on in life that many of us just don't have.
Wonderful, thank you. And I liked the fact that you brought in a whole new perspective into the argument that we often forget. And thank you for sharing your earliest experience of being in state sector and why you were there as well. Thank you. Val.
Right, well, I don't know that there is a need per se for private education, but
Val, can I just interrupt you? Val, can I just interrupt you for one moment? The streaming isn't so great, so I wonder if you stop the video, whether we'd be able to hear you better.
Okay, so turn off the video.
Just do stop video.
Oh, I can see that. Okay, can you hear me better?
Much better, thank you.
So I was saying, I don't know that there is a need for private education, but I believe it's here to stay. Private education has this aura that is based mainly on perception. And then for me, there's a context of reality. The perception is practice is better. The best education we can buy. There is parent power, better pay and working conditions for staff, less regulations, so far more with the curriculum, and perhaps a wide of extracurricular activities. The reality is, however, that many schools are excellent, and not all private schools carry the hallmark of academic distinction. So that the concept of value added, which we work on in the state school. State schools do a lot more with a lot less, and they're nailing it. I mean, you can't fight that. That is a skill that is honed within the state schools. Private school students have a different starting point because generally they have extensive tutoring and they have private tutors. Yet it is widely perceived that private schools are better. Would they be better if they didn't have all the added financial investment? So it comes back to what Sufian was saying about the context of poverty and money and how this all plays out in the system. Would they be able to stand up to the government regulations that are imposed on the state sector? For me, and this is what I find, I think, a bit jarring, is the underlying message for me when one aspect of education has to have all these government regulations, and another aspect of education just doesn't have to have it because they're the upper echelons. For me, the underlying message is that certain members of society are above the law. And we see this playing out before our very eyes with our current Prime Minister. He seems to be above the law in certain ways. So far be it for me to tell the wealthy or the aspiring what to do with their money. That is not what I'm here for, because we know a private school education opens all kinds of doors, careers, and it also immediately identifies the recipient as belonging to the right circles, the right social circles, that is. So just 7% were privately educated, and only 1% of that 7% graduate from Oxford and Cambridge. However, these 7% of privately educated elites overwhelmingly represent our senior judges, civil service permanent secretaries, members of the House of Lords, foreign and Commonwealth diplomats, and interestingly enough, 39% of cabinet ministers. And the media also has some of the highest numbers of privately educated people. So it's a nice, tight, neat circle of influence, while the power gap grows wider and wider with people who influence the lives of the wider public. Actually, they're a little bit unable to relate to ordinary citizens because of the kinds of backgrounds that they have. I suppose for me, all schools market themselves on high expectations for their students, which is as it should be. But then I listen to the musings of the strictest head teacher in all of Britain, who believes in drilling children to regurgitate knowledge on paper to pass exams, while the private school system promotes a wide range of extracurricular activities and focus on the acquisition of soft skills to prepare student education. So essential skills such as confidence, the ability to articulate them as well, teamwork, all of these things that are vital to career success and their lives beyond education. So the Education Secretary says Britain should be proud of its private school system. The bigger question for me is, does the education system purposefully educate some students to fill the low-wage job market while grooming the elite to fill top jobs and to continue to have major influence over the lives of people they supposedly represent, but will never be able to relate to? So that's my perspective.
That's just absolutely wonderful. Thank you for sharing so beautifully, Val. And you actually raise a point which leads neatly into the next question that I wanted to ask. Sufian has dropped off, and I'm presuming that he's got a problem. He's home alone with his children, so he's probably got a problem with them and may join us later. But we go on because we've still got Val and we've got Hazel, and then we've got other people here who may want to join in the discussion at the end, but it's for now, it's just the panel. So given that the one thread that has come through each panelist is the fact that essentially private school gives you access to a network which enables you to apply for jobs in privileged positions and jobs with authority. As a consequence of that, in this country, are we paying a high price as a population because we have such low ambition in terms of outcomes for the people who are the key decision makers? Do we want the most able people in the country making decisions, running the biggest organizations, being being part of the media system, being members of parliament, making those key decisions for us? Do we want the brightest people, the most intellectually able people, the people who earn these jobs based on the merit of their intellect? Or are we happy having mediocre people who've gone to the right schools? Maybe start with you, Val.
I know that's what we want. It's what we should want. I have a feeling, however, that the system isn't rigged in that way. And unfortunately, it from time immemorial, the system here has been set to accommodate the elite. It's a class system within Britain. So the elite is set to always be the elite, and they will fight tooth and nail to maintain that. If you look at the Houses of Lords, for example, the Queen, what is it? Recruit people and their peers. The majority of them are peers of some sort. And she recruits these people based on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. So you have everything is all tucked up. It's neat, and that's what it's there for. The system it's almost a serfdom in reality. That's what we have. And then you have to put in the dynamics of it being a multicultural society and what all of that has in terms of what is idealistic for society here. We have to understand that, as bright as my children may be, the reality of them ever being at the top without them speaking, without being honest, without them speaking the language of whiteness is never going to happen. The people who are at the top are the Black people who are at the top are the people who speak the language of whiteness, and they are seen to be okay to help to perpetuate what the elite need, what they need to happen in society. So it would need a proper overhaul for it to be a true meritocracy. That's my opinion. And I don't know that the political will is there, because you have to be, as I'm saying, the right social circle to have that political pull and influence. So I don't think in reality that's going to change.
So we go on selling ourselves short, which is a real shame.
I don't think we should sell ourselves short. I'm just trying. I think we have to be real about what the potential for change is, and the potential for change actually is going to take a lot more unity, and that unity will never be allowed to happen. It takes a lot of people who are pulling in the same direction for that to happen. But you only have to be on Twitter to see that if you have people who are pulling in the right direction, there is always the wrong kind of disruptor. Sufian, you're the right kind of disruptor, but we have the wrong kinds of disruptors as well. So it's an interesting space to be in, but we have to keep pecking away at it, because we can't lie down and let it happen. So it's just about having the courage and the resilience to get up and just keep picking away at it.
Thank you, Val. Hazel, what I'd like to know is how do we narrow the gap? We talk about narrowing the gap. Yeah. But how do we really narrow the gap?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, as I was thinking about this and preparing for this, was I was thinking about, well, yeah, what is the difference? And the difference is it comes down to the resources. It comes down to, at the end of the day, the money available. And obviously private schools, they have, by the very nature of what they are fee-paying schools. They charge a lot of money to get then what they provide. They've got the alumni who gift money. They have got the people who then use their connections, so that actually sometimes they're not paying the full price for a particular thing or a particular business to offer them something because, oh well, so-and-so used to go here or is married to so-and-so. And the more and more I go on, I keep coming back to Terry Pratchett and some of his Discworld comments around wealth and the Sam Vine's sort of philosophy on wealth. And it is the fact that, yeah, a rich person can live on a lot less, sometimes can live on a lot less, because actually they're able to afford to buy the higher quality items, the higher quality things that will last longer. So it might, yeah, the poor person will buy the cheap shoes that will last 6 months, whereas the rich person can afford to buy the really good quality shoes that will last a couple of years. Not that they'll probably ever wear them long enough to do that, but that sort of approach and principle. And I think there's a lot to be said in that, in terms of that schools are so often pushed, state schools are so often pushed to the accounting for every penny and making every penny count. And it's so much about the here and now. And I was discussing this in a book group just last night, but it's about us having that space. And I think in terms of money and provision and resourcing as well, having the space not to just be going, how do we get through the next financial year? But what are we investing in, and how are we making that space for aspiration and growth for the future, in a longer term future, that most state schools can't think beyond the next financial or couple of financial years overall. Whereas in private schools, they can be thinking about 5 to 10 years down the line at least, because they know they're going to have a steady amount of about this much coming in. They know what they've got to pay roughly for what's going out, but they can have the devices for every child. They've got the high-speed broadband. They know that the children at home that are sort of day students and all the rest of it, and aren't boarding students, are going home to homes that have got all those things. They're not having to worry about, are they running a breakfast club to feed children that are coming in hungry? They're not having to worry about how they also run a second-hand clothing shop in the school for the kids that can't afford uniform or are coming in with holes in their shoes. They're not dealing with the same on the coalface cost of living crisis, poverty related issues that most state schools are. And to then go back to how we then narrow the gap is, what we need is we need to readdress that balance. We need to see higher taxes, way back from just talking education. We need to see the higher taxes on the top few percent. We need to see that we are taking that money and actually using it for the betterment of the many, rather than to further lift up the few. And I think that it goes way beyond what we can just do in education, but it does take that societal change. And as Valerie was saying, we're not in a position where, because that's not even a glass ceiling, it's glass walls all around us that we can get so far. But unless you're willing to learn the language or talk the talk, the chances of you getting through and into that inner chamber are so small. I don't know whether it is a case of having the people that are able to do that and keep their sense of self and their values. I don't know whether it's about we need a giant sledgehammer and we just need to break the system and rebuild. I think there's maybe a bit of both that needs to go on. And I think even thinking back to politics right now, and we've got that, do we want the best qualified, or do we want the person with those social skills? And we're seeing that. We've got a prime minister who has went through all those nice open doors, who had all those privileges, who knows or has that big social circle of all the right people in their phone book. And then we've got someone like the current leader of the opposition, who again has worked very hard, has committed himself to his career and to his profession, to go up the levels, to then go into politics. He has built his reputation. And what does he get? Now, yes, okay, we can talk about the influences on our media and our mainstream media and how that then alters people's perceptions. But he's seen as boring. He's seen as staid. He's seen as someone that you wouldn't want to have at a party, while Boris is then having his parties. And so actually, when given the option of a solid person with solid credentials who has worked hard to get to where they are, against someone who has had everything basically paved out to get to where he is with very little effort on his part, the public has voted. And I think that I don't know how we combat that. I suppose we combat that by continuing to walk into schools every day and teach the children now in front of us that values do matter, that actually, yes, you should want to achieve, you can aspire, and actually you can stay true to yourself and true to what is right while doing it, without giving away and speaking a different language, whether that's of whiteness or whether that's of wealth and privilege, which often are the same thing, I am aware. And actually telling them that they can be true to themselves and still achieve. And I suppose it is just that bit of we've got to keep working so the children now can keep changing and keep changing things going forward, and we keep calling to account the people that we don't see change doing it now. But so much of that is beyond what we can do, I know.
Wonderful, thank you, Hazel. Sufian, you have this very senior position in a teaching school, and given that it's clear that the purpose of private education is that you have membership of this exclusive club, which gives you access to power and to further privilege. What do you say to the teachers in your school in terms of their hopes and ambition for the children? And what do you want them to say to the children? Are we telling the children a lie? Because at the moment, what we say to the children is, if you work hard and you leave school with all the right pieces of paper, that will then open doors to the best universities, which are then going to open doors to the best jobs in the land. But we've pretty much established that that's not necessarily going to be the case. There are going to be some children who are going to work incredibly hard and will always just get to somewhere in the middle, maybe a bit more comfortable than their parents, but never going to have the same privileges afforded to those who have maybe gone through private education. So how do we inspire hope in our teachers who are training at the Chiltern Trust, and how do they go about inspiring the children to be ambitious and promising the children that those doors are going to be open to them?
I think the twofold. One is probably the fact that within the trust, we're incredibly lucky. Things are changing, and what it does show is when you have and when you invest in addressing the inequalities in the system, the constant I'm going to give a little plug to a blog I wrote that's coming out in Schools Week around the whole fact that actually the narrative has been around the fact that, right, Alison, what more can you do? Valerie, what more can you do to encourage people from your communities to get involved in education? Well, actually, the NFER data shows we're trying to get in. We're stuck at the door. No one's opening the door, let alone letting us progress. They're just not letting us in the door to get into the profession, because the level of applications from Black and Asians are right up there. What's happening is we don't get in and everyone else gets in. So we know that there's a massive challenge around that. What I know is within our trust, we've done a huge amount of work around this. I've been privileged to work with some of the most supportive leaders. And you require a lot of support when you're out there as a disruptor saying, right, we want change. But in the last 2 weeks, we've employed 22 leaders and teachers across the trust. 18 of those are from a minoritized community. That's unprecedented at a trust level around the UK. 18 out of 22 on meritocracy. No one got a job because they're Black, because they're Asian. They got a job because we said, if you're the best at what you do, and if you turn up and rock up to us, the one thing we're not going to do is let that which is out of your control disadvantage you at the point of coming to work for us. So what are we doing a favor to the system? No, we're not. We're benefiting hugely. We're a massive beneficiary of the fact that people now think, if you want a fair playing field and you want to advance as a leader, as a teacher, Chiltern Learning Trust is the place, because actually what we're saying is come come to us, and meritocracy will be the way forward. No such thing as positive discrimination. I don't want anyone to give me a job or my kids a job in the future because of filling a quota, because of positive discrimination. I want to be there because I reckon I'm good enough. The question about what do we do? What do I tell? What do I tell my kids? The reality is, Alison, I get frustrated. My daughter is 6 years old. My son is 5 years old. I don't like it when schools tell them that they can be an astronaut. They can't. The chances of them being an astronaut is virtually nigh on impossible, because they can't even be a head teacher 20 meters up that corridor from that classroom where they are. You know, tell them they can be the head teacher. Tell them they can be a deputy before you tell them they're going to go on the moon. Don't sell my kids a pipe dream. That is not going to be possible, because actually my kids need resilience. Then, because it's resilience to be an ethnic minority leader in the system right now, you're going to get battered and you're going to get bruised. You need resilience. And what I don't want is, I don't want my kids to be snowflakes. I don't want participation medals, because life doesn't throw participation medals at you. Alison, we don't get participation medals for just being educators. No one's told us well done just for being educators. That's not helped us progress. We don't get the same pay as others because we're there. We don't get the same positions and authority because we're there. So I don't want that instilled in my children. It's not about, if you didn't win the race in sports day, you didn't win the race. Don't come home with a participation medal. I don't want that, because the life they're preparing you for ain't the life you're going to live as a Pakistani kid. Yeah, as a Pakistani adult in this country, that ain't the life. What my dad taught me, and I believe is absolutely correct. My dad said that just to be equal, you're going to have to work 10 times harder. And I believe in that. I believe in that. And what I do say to young people that are in the system coming from an ethnic minority background, and I'm unapologetic about that, because that's where we are as a system. I will say to leaders, and I've said it in the last couple of weeks, if everyone starts at 8 o'clock, you start at 7. And if everyone finishes at 4, you finish at 7. Why? Just to stay afloat, you're going to have to do that, because you're going to have to work harder than everyone else. Why? Because of the color of your skin, but that doesn't matter. Get on with it and do it, because that's the world we live in. That's horrible that I have to think like that. That's horrible that I have to say that, but that's the reality. There's no point beating around the bush. The reality is to say you are going to go for interviews and you're not going to get it. And you know what? You're never going to realize why you didn't get it, because you're going to be told you've marginally missed out. And your life is going to be about marginally missing out again and again and again. And that resilience and that punch to the face every time, it wears you away. It wears you away. So for me, it's about, you're going to be a young teacher. You want to be a young leader. You're from ethnic minority background. You know what? Toughen up, because it's going to be a roller coaster. It's going to be a tough journey here. But what we're doing as leaders from ethnic minority backgrounds right now, we're paving the way. We're paving the way so that it can be equal and it can be different for those that come after us. So work hard now so that we see the fruit for our kids, that they can have a better chance at being equal. That's the reality of where we live. And that's the reality when teachers go through in the system. For me, it's about, right, don't measure yourself on the person next to you. I don't measure myself on the person that's next to me, because I know when I rock up into conferences as a senior leader, I am the only one that looks like me. And there is no other shade like me. And therefore, I know that I've got to be on top of my game, because otherwise people will say that. When people see me in positions, guess what? Even though I've worked hard to get where I am, I'm going to be the token P. That's the word they use. Whether we like it or not, that's what people will say. Oh, yeah, they've got the token so-and-so. And you know what? I don't care. There's conferences I'm invited to because I invite myself to it. I turn around and I say to them, you need me there because it's too white on that panel. And I will take the token position because I'm going to come and say what I want to say so I can change what needs to be changed. And I think that's the important part that we really need to recognize. We really need to understand that at the moment we're seeing green shoots. But remember this, so many green shoots come through, but they get stamped on. They might make it back up, They need support. You need to tie things around those trees to support them from the wind. There's going to be a lot of tough things that are going to happen to us as we go along on the journey. Privilege is very hard to fight against privilege. And privilege comes in various forms. I accept the fact that people will say that, you know what, you can be from a white working class background and you will have the same challenges. I agree. The statistics at school level show the same. But you won't get drawn out because of your name. Your name, my name ain't going to get through. My credentials mean nothing. I can apply for the same number of jobs as Kathy and Hazel. And we can be equal. If not, I can be better. The chances are, if your name is Mohammed Sufian Sadiq, then Mohammed will rule you out straight away. Your chances are significantly lower. If I then rock up as a Pakistani male, there's a massive issue. If I rock up with a beard, I'm synonymized with a radical fundamentalist because of the way the system works. I've got to accept that is what it is. So I'm constantly fighting against prejudice that exists within the system. What we need to appreciate is that we've got to tell our children that. We don't sell. Don't, like, you know, when people think they're doing my kids a favor by saying, you know what, you could try and you can be anything you want to be. No, they can't. What they can do, I want them to work hard, and I want them to smash ceilings and smash barriers, because they're going to face barriers. The one thing they need to have is the resilience and the fight and the grit to say, I'm going to go out there and my life is going to be a life of a fight. It's going to be a fighter. I'm going to have to fight, because the path ain't going to be smooth. We have the same paths. My path to senior leadership, to a different person's path, is the same path. That's not to say the white person has not worked as hard, or if not harder than me. They may well have. Just my one has thorns and hurdles that they may not have in theirs. And overcoming those thorns and hurdles means that I might need to change direction. I might get blocked. I might stay standing where I can't jump over because the hurdle's too high for me for a period of time. I've got to grow. I've got to strengthen myself and then try again. The inequality exists. So when people say, Sufian, you're a champion of equality, why would you, if I see people, and they can send their kids to private education, I'd say, do it. If you're black and you can send your child to a private school because you can afford it, then you know what? Guess what? Right now, the system's stacked up against you. If you're a black boy in London and you're in the south of London, the system is stacked against you, young man. And if your parents can pay for you to go through a private system that gets you the network, that gets that name on your CV around that school, that allows you to get into Oxbridge, then take the passport while it's there. Why not? Why not take it? Because the inequality means that that's not my fault that the inequality exists. What I know is that I've got to do and want what's best. My kids go to a state school. They don't go to a private school. But I don't hold any grudges against those that do, because I know that it's an unequal playing field. And if you're a parent, the one thing you want most for your child is a fair chance. And if you could buy a fair chance, every one of us would try and buy a fair chance if we could for them. Okay. It's sad that we have to think that way.
Thank you, Sufian. Val, you want to come back?
I'm very mindful of the fact that we create a two-tiered system. And, you know, we still are having this argument of traditional education versus progressive education. My problem is when you work with our students and they are just there to regurgitate knowledge and get through those exams, you can almost guarantee that only a tiny fraction of them are going to get through any university, because they haven't got the skills, neither the social skills or the problem-solving skills or the skills to work on their own, because they've been spoon-fed this stuff that they only have to, excuse my French, vomit onto a piece of paper to get the school they're coming from with these glowing league tables. My problem with all of that is, why are we Why is that okay? And you see it being promoted so heavily, you know, for our children not to have the capacity to apply knowledge, only to regurgitate it. That for me is a problem within the state schools that are choosing this option of having children march down corridors, you know, as if they're already fitting them for a criminal justice, you know, not criminal justice, fitting them for prison and that kind of regimental kind of living. I have a problem with that. I have a deep problem with it. And I absolutely have a problem with the way it's promoted by these people from the upper echelons who didn't have that experience. So why is it okay for old kids? So that's my pet peeve. Sorry.
Thank you. And we're going to, we've slightly over time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come back to Hazel to see whether or not you want to have a closing statement as well. And then there are others who have joined us who want to say something, but I'm going to draw this bit of the discussion to a conclusion because it was always about the panel discussion first and foremost. So Hazel, we're going to close with you.
Yeah, I think so much of what's been said is very much my view as well. And I definitely think, yes, we want, if money can help take away an obstacle, then yeah, you're going to go for that. And again, we want in the long term of humanity that not to be the case, but it is the reality of the now. And also I agree about the two-tier system and that sort of, I keep on coming back to the word feudal recently. And I think that it is this return to this feudal setup where, yes, there is freedom for the elite, but it is almost the sometimes the regimentation or the regurgitation of knowledge without encouraging, giving opportunities for children to think, or we know they're being taught in many state schools that really the reality is we hear that from so many teachers that they're doing all they can with that, but at times that's what they're being told that they've got to test for, or they're teaching to SATs, whatever. Obviously it's slightly different in Scotland, so we've got a very different curriculum within that, but we see the same sort of pressures on assessment, tracking, monitoring as everywhere else does. And I think that bit of it's teaching people to be okay at following and accepting that things will just keep being the way they are. And that's how we've sleepwalked ourselves for the most part as a society and as a culture into the position we're now in politically and societally. We're seeing that in terms of climate. We're seeing that in terms of poverty. We're seeing that in terms of global conflicts because we accept the fact overall that things will be the way they are, and that's just the way things are. And I think that's what I'd like to see, and I like the idea that, and I think that's what we need to do, the disruptors. We need to be raising, we need to be educating children to be disruptors, not to be disruptive, not to be lashing out for no reason, not to be misbehaving, not to be lax and not having boundaries and expectations on them, but to get them to challenge us, to turn around and go, but why? There's nothing I like more. Well, sometimes it's the lasting one, but there's nothing I enjoy more than when a child turns around and goes, but why is that happening? But why is that? Why do we do it that way? Because it shows they're actually engaging their brain. It shows that they're thinking. They're not just repeating knowledge, but they're actually working things out. And I do think that is something that we need. And we do maybe see more again, and potentially in maybe private or in sort of the more well-off state schools where again there's maybe more money, there's more other things, all those soft skills, those extra activities. But I think that's where again as much richness as we can bring to our state schools, not just in terms of the range of activities we're doing, but in terms of the thinking and encouraging to think that we can give to our children. That is the best hope we can give them, to then take the knowledge that we are giving them, to take the knowledge that we are helping them absorb and learn, and then help them to process it to process that alongside what their values, what their priorities are, and then think, well, yeah, what is my achievable ambition, my achievable goal, and how am I going to get there? And how am I going to challenge the system to get there and overcome the obstacles? And I think that is it. It comes down to teaching them critical thinking.
Thank you. Well, that was a really insightful discussion, and I want to say a huge thank you to Hazel, Valerie, and to Sufian for being such excellent panelists and for sharing your views so openly and so courageously. We do clearly have a two-tier system. We've got a system where privilege opens doors and all of those sorts of things. And then we've got the other group of people who are just going to have to, as Sufian said, toughen up and face the reality of the fact that we are in a system that is inequitable, but we keep pushing against that door for change. And we also need to remember that it's difficult for us to recognize any system of inequality that is privileging us. And that is why we will always have that inequality, because the very people we are asking to be inclusive and equitable are the ones who don't want to recognize their privilege, because it means extending a table, and not everybody, as a lot of people will see extending the table as losing their rights, or maybe when we saw the whole article come out in the Times about Cambridge or Oxbridge only taking or not having such a high quota of private education pupils, that was seen as cancel culture, rather than recognizing that actually only 7% of children in this country are in private education. So why shouldn't they just be taking on 7% of the brightest, most able children in private education, in those sorts of universities, and opening the doors to the rest of the children who have that intellectual ability? So we are nowhere near ending this discussion. And I imagine that if we were here in 21-22, we will still be having the same discussion, because we've got a long, long way to go.